Okay, so what is there? Everything right. I mean, that's the obvious answer, but...
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, today we're going to tackle a really tricky philosophical question.
About existence.
Exactly. Like, what do we mean when we talk about things that don't exist?
And what about things that could exist but don't?
Yeah, like potential.
Right, possibilities.
Possibilities, yeah. It all comes down to what does it really mean for something to be?
Yeah, and it's a question that has occupied philosophers for centuries. And today,
Yeah, for centuries.
we're going to be looking at one particular approach to this question through the work of the philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine.
Quine, yep.
And specifically, his very influential 1948 essay on what there is.
So this is like a classic in the field of ontology.
Absolutely. It's one of the most important works in 20th century metaphysics.
Okay, so let's dive into this essay.
Okay, so to really grasp Quine's point, let's start with what seems like a simple statement. Pegasus does not exist.
Okay, Pegasus does not exist.
Very
right.
Well, not really, because this brings up something that's been called Plato's beard.
Plato's beard, okay.
Yeah, it's the problem of how can we refer to something in order to say that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, if I'm saying Pegasus doesn't exist, doesn't that mean I'm in some way acknowledging it as some kind of thing?
Right, so the problem is, how can we deny the existence of something without seeming to grant it some form of being just by talking about it?
So how do we make sense of this?
Well, Quine offers a really powerful way to think about it through the idea of ontological commitment.
Okay.
He has this famous slogan, "To be is to be the value of a variable."
To be is to be the value of a variable. Okay,
Yeah.
Unpack that for us.
Sure. So in simpler terms, what this means is that when we put forward a theory, a scientific theory, a philosophical theory, whatever, that theory is committed to the existence of the things that it needs to talk about in order for its statements to be true.
Right. Okay, so it's not so much about making direct claims about what exists, but rather about what our theories logically imply or require. Okay, so how does this apply to Pegasus?
Well, Quine draws on another really important philosophical idea here, Bertrand Russell's theory of descriptions.
Okay.
And what Russell showed was that we can take statements that seem to refer to non-existent things and rephrase them in a way that avoids any such commitment.
So instead of saying Pegasus does not exist,
Yeah.
how would we rephrase that using the theory of descriptions?
We could say something like, there is no X, such that X is a winged horse and X was captured by Bellerophon.
So now we're not directly referring to Pegasus as an entity.
Right, we've basically analyzed away the apparent reference to Pegasus.
Yeah, it's like a neat logical trick.
Yeah, it's a way of dissolving certain philosophical puzzles without having to posit all sorts of strange entities.
But things get a bit more complicated when we bring in other philosophers like Henry Wyman, who actually argues for the existence of what he calls unactualized possibles.
So for Wyman, things like Pegasus, they don't exist in the way that you and I exist,
Right.
but they still have a kind of being as possibilities. They're just lacking actuality.
Yeah, so he makes this distinction between existence for actual things like us and a broader notion of being that includes these possibilities.
Right, and this might seem intuitively plausible. I mean, there does seem to be a difference between something like a unicorn, which is purely imaginary, and something like a city on Mars, which could conceivably exist.
Yeah.
So Wyman is trying to capture that distinction.
But Quine strongly disagrees with this view, and he has some pretty compelling arguments against it.
Yeah, he refers to this realm of possibles as a slum.
A slum of possible.
Yeah, a slum of possibles. He thinks it's just messy and unnecessary.
So what's wrong with the idea of unactualized possibles?
Well, Quine raises a key problem,
Hmm.
the problem of individuation.
Individuation.
Yeah, how do we distinguish between different possible things?
So how do we know if we're talking about the same possible thing or different ones?
Exactly. He gives us a great example. Imagine a possible fat man in the doorway and a possible bald man in the doorway.
Okay.
Are these two different possible men, or is it the same man who might be both fat and bald?
Right. How can we tell when we're dealing with something that doesn't actually exist?
It becomes really difficult to establish clear criteria for identity and difference.
And for Quine, this just shows that the whole notion of unactualized possibles is too vague and problematic.
Yeah, he much prefers what he calls a desert landscape ontology.
A desert landscape so sparse and minimal.
Exactly. He thinks we should only be committed to the existence of those things that are absolutely necessary to explain our experience.
So he's advocating for a kind of ontological parsimony.
Right. We should be as stingy as possible when it comes to what we say exists.
And this also extends to his skepticism about possible worlds,
Yeah, the idea that there are all these other ways the world could have been.
because he sees those as just another form of ontological extravagance.
Exactly. He thinks it leads to all sorts of problems about how to identify things across different possible worlds.
So like we're multiplying entities unnecessarily.
Yeah, and Quine's whole point is that we don't need all this extra baggage to make sense of the world.
We can have a much cleaner and more economical view of what exists.
And this leads to a really interesting question for us to think about. How do Quine's ideas apply to discussions about things like abstract objects or theoretical entities?
Like in physics or mathematics?
Exactly. Do these things have some kind of being just because we can talk about them?
Or are we just projecting our own conceptual frameworks onto reality?
It's a question that's still debated today, and it really forces us to think carefully about what we're committed to when we make claims about what exists.
Yeah, it's a challenge to be precise and rigorous in our thinking.
Absolutely. And that's the lasting legacy of Quine's work on ontology.
It's about really scrutinizing what our theories and our language commit us to believing.
Yeah, and being willing to question whether we really need all the things that we sometimes think we need.
So it's a call for a kind of philosophical spring cleaning.
Exactly. Let's clear out the clutter and see what's truly essential.
So next time you're talking about something that might not exist,
Remember Quine's challenge.
think carefully about whether you're really committed to its being or whether it's just a phantom of language.
Food for thought.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep on diving deep.
Keep on diving.